Good morning. I haven't learned to say that in Turkish yet. I apologize. I will, though. How many of you have ever thought about winning the Nobel Prize? Anybody? Well, the interesting thing is that the topic that we're discussing this week, sustainable water resources, could very well lead you to that. And one of the reasons I bring it up is that Springer, the company that I work with as far as several different journals and book series, has had the published works of 175 Nobel Prize winners. So there may very well be somebody in this audience that one day will win the Nobel Prize. So certainly something to strive for. So, but the topics of this conference or the speakers that we've actually had Dr. Azari and Dr. Kofler and Dr. Glazechev, and Dr. Kofler and Dr. Glazechev's contemporaries just won the Nobel Prize for a similar area of work that they spoke on while they were here. And so there is that possibility, and I'll tell you a little bit about we're going to be publishing a special issue of Sustainable Water Resources Management, which is this journal right here. So there'll be probably 20 to 30 papers presented from people that make their presentations here. And Sustainable Water Resources Management is a newer journal. It's published 4 times a year, and then we also publish several other journals. There's Environmental Earth Sciences, which is this journal, and this is the journal that got us started. It was started being published in 1982, and my father was editor of that, and I was fortunate to be able to continue that. It's published 24 times a year, and so it's it has quite an established history, and it's very practical in its applications, and so it's a good journal to submit your papers to. And I also edit Carbonates and Evaporites, which is published 4 times a year, and it too has been, both of these journals have been published for over 35 years now, so they have good established records for places to publish your articles. This is for weightlifting. So, but this is the first book that Professor Gokchekis and I worked on together. This was published from a conference in 2007, and Professor Gokchekis was really at the forefront of this topic of sustainability, and this is one of the publications that was the first ones in the field. And we did a special issue of environmental geology from that conference as well. So. Today I'm going to talk to you about sustainable water resources management and use a couple of case studies as examples. I always dedicate this speech to my father, who started our consulting company, P.E. Lamoureux & Associates, and we're celebrating our 57th year of being in business this year. We do work in water resources, environmental assessments, and hazardous waste, and our work, particularly in limestone or karst terrains, has taken us all around the world, because 20% of the Earth's surface is limestone. So. Hydrogeology plays a major role in all aspects of environmental planning, execution, and implementation. Without a safe, sustainable water supply, life cannot exist, and hopes for prosperity are limited. We certainly know this from coming from arid countries like Cyprus and Egypt and Syria. Much of future world demands will be made up of the groundwater component, and the United Nations has identified water resources as a top priority. Attention is particularly drawn to freshwater stress, which relates water withdrawal to percentage of water available. Based on the current rate of usage, the United Nations is not very optimistic about the global water outlook. Here you can see a graphic of their projections up to 1925. To address the issue of the world needs to embrace sustainable water development, or SWD as we call it. It's the development of water in a manner in which an adequate supply of good quality water is sustained and the watercourse ecosystem is maintained for the uses of future generations. This was what the Prime Minister yesterday was stressing, is the fact that it's up to us to make sure that our children and grandchildren have a world to live in that's safe and has water to use. Water quantity and water quality, as we know, are inextricably linked. Therefore, there needs to be rapid movement towards SWD in developed and developing countries. There are 5 specific elements that are included in sustainable water development, and they include the right to use water, the protection of water resources and prevention of water degradation, the maintenance of water flow, an ecosystem-related approach, and the procedural elements to achieve sustainable development. The right to use water involves comprehensive permitting with continuing review, strategic counseling, crisis management, creative dispute resolution, and enhanced relations with stakeholder and community groups. We wouldn't necessarily think of that when you're talking more about a technical field, but it is very important. Protection of water resources and prevention of water degradation includes addressing non-point sources of pollution on a national, regional, and local basis, land use controls, integration of water and land management, and regulation of interbasin transfers. Maintenance of water flow involves in-stream flows and environmental flows and may require appropriate controls. An ecosystem-related approach should not be limited only to watercourse mainstream or tributaries, but it should also incorporate terrestrial and marine environments interacting with it. It should promote health of the entire ecosystem and utilize watershed management authorities. To move towards sustainable water development, freshwater needs to be managed in a holistic manner, or in other words, an ecosystem approach. Management of water resources is holistic when it's done on a catchment or drainage basin basis. This includes both land and water resources, since land use can have significant impacts on freshwater and related ecosystems. And we don't always take that into consideration, so it is important to keep in mind. Thus, water legislation should provide for a holistic ecosystem approach to the management of water. Today I'm going to be talking about 2 projects that our company has performed. One is in the Kharga Oasis of Western Desert of Egypt, and the other is in Damascus, Syria, on the Fijay Spring, which is the 3rd largest spring in the world. The Kharga Oasis in Egypt has one of the longest continuing records of human use of groundwater in the world. Its present landscape has evolved over several million years of erosion, structure, and deformation of beds. Its geographic position and changes in climate over the past thousands of years have resulted in conditions favorable for inhabitation by man. And one of the things that we did, or my father started in the 1950s, was to go into the Western Desert and help develop water wells with the purpose of many people had moved to the cities, and so the government wanted them to move back to the desert, so that we helped develop the water supply so that they could grow their crops. This is a map of the Nubian sandstone, and it's a topographic depression in the Western Desert of Egypt that's oriented north and south, parallel to the Nile Valley. The climate, as you might imagine, is arid, rainfall is sporadic, and temperatures are hot during summer months. The mean annual rainfall is less than 1 millimeter. Groundwater reserves have been studied for long-term socioeconomic development. The Nubian sandstone forms a complex aquifer system and has been providing water to artesian wells and springs for several thousand years. It's a thick sequence of coarse clastic sediments of sandstone, sandy clay, interbedded with shale, chalk, and clay beds. Here's one of the wells that was drilled in the desert, and they produce about 3,000 gallons per minute, and the water temperature is about 98 degrees Fahrenheit. I guess that's, 30 degrees or so centigrade, and has a slightly salty taste and smells like rotten eggs. But you can say the boys here are enjoying playing in it, but it's also a very important source of water for growth of the area. Nearly all the wells originally flowed, but exploitation of groundwater from deeper and deeper wells for irrigation began about 1959. Natural flows, as you might imagine, declined as more and more closely spaced deep wells were drilled. By 1975, many wells had ceased to flow due to the annual withdrawal of 1.7 billion cubic meters of water that was withdrawn from 1960 to 1990. Sustainability of water resources is related to the history of karst hydrogeology through the inhabitation of cargo oases. Evidence exists of a post-Pleistocene lake covering much of the oasis at a level of 70 meters above sea level. The interesting thing is that nowadays, from all the water pumping out of these wells, there's a lake that's been formed and is similar back to what it was many years ago. The existence of good soils in these low areas allow desert cultures to expand around them. One of the first times I remember going there was we traveled through the desert for 2 or 3 days to get there. And then all of a sudden, out in the middle of the desert were these beautiful crops that were growing that were being produced by these wells. Evidence indicates that prehistoric man and subsequent the Romans used springs and cargo oases for water supply. Caravan routes crossed the area from Sudan to Libya, and maybe some of Shaban's relatives or ancestors were part of those caravans. Their stone temples, fortresses, and brick strongholds were built and remain as evidence of occupation by Persia, Greco-Roman, Roman, Coptic, and subsequently Arab peoples. Our inhabitants continued to use these ancient springs and wells, supplemented at present by groundwater from the deep artesian wells penetrating the deeper Nubian sandstone. The challenge today is to manage the water resources in the area to allow continued development without the ups and downs of previous eras. Large reserves of groundwater remain in the western desert of Egypt, which is surprising. You wouldn't necessarily think that after they pumped as much water as they have. But the reserves can be developed effectively for the future, but they must be developed cautiously. Today, as we've said, water continues to flow at a reduced rate, and the croplands do have a thin layer of salt, which diminishes the productivity of the land. Being a complex geologic unit, the Nubian comprises a very large storage system which contains good quality water and moves slowly through the sandstone beds. And to that extent, this is a safety factor. Even though much of these resources have been wasted in the past and artesian heads have been reduced drastically in some local areas, much water remains for future development. Applying the ideas of sustainable water resources and utilizing state-of-the-art technologies available today will help better manage this resource for future generations, which is what we're all here for. Fizeh Springs, as I said, is the third largest spring in the world, and formerly it supplied the city it was the sole source of water supply for the city of Damascus. Unfortunately, with the war, that flow has been interrupted, and so it's in that instance this will be more an example of what might be done in the future. So It was first developed by the Romans, and remains of Roman baths and of aqueducts leading south toward the city of Damascus are evidence of the early development. My father, Dr. Phil Lamoureux, wrote a book on springs and bottled waters of the world, and he had many of the famous hydrogeologists around the world write summaries of the springs in their particular area. And many of these famous springs have, however, had documented problems of contamination back to ancient times. But some of you may know that Dr. Orhan brought me bottles from Turkey this time, and but we have a collection of about 1,500 water bottles from around the world, and my father collected about 1,000 of them, and then I've continued that collection. So one of these days we hope to do a second edition of this book. In mythology, Fiji has been related to the Garden of Eden, and in fact, Dr. Meinzer, who was head of the groundwater branch for the U.S. Geological Survey, often remarked that parts of the Bible read like a water supply paper. This shows the location of the Fiji Springs. And Pila performed hydrogeological studies in the vicinity of Fiji Spring to determine groundwater flow paths, recharge, storage, and discharge, and the maximum reliable yield. And the purpose of these studies was the fact that the water in the Fiji Spring was not adequate to supply the city, and so they wanted to look for an additional source to help supplement that. And so that's what we did. We went in and did pumping tests and actually determined that additional water could be supplied from side springs to the large spring. The project provided information on which to base pumpage to augment low season flows from the spring. Studies performed include detailed surface geologic mapping, air photo interpretation, well and spring inventory, and a systematic quality of water sampling program. And one thing to keep in mind is that hydrogeologic barriers aren't limited to the boundary of the country. So in this particular instance, we had to go into Lebanon to map the recharge area of the spring, which wasn't the smartest thing to do at that time, but it was necessary in order to come up with a solution to the problem. The geologic structural work included mapping, joining, faulting, and folding, and analysis of their impact on groundwater movement. Detailed quantitative studies were made on the large springs supplying Damascus water supply, with detailed monitoring during the pumping. Pumping test results indicated that with proper control and managed modification, flow augmentation was available to support the needs of Damascus during the low flow season. The reduction in storage is replaced by rains during the early part of the recharge period, and also snowmelt from the mountains. Understanding the reservoir system from which water flows, the flow direction, and the rate of water withdrawn allows determination of the area around Fiji Spring in which environmental restraints should be imposed on development. This is sort of like a vulnerability area in which you actually divide the different zones up into one where the water is totally protected, another where you'd have permits that would restrict the water that you're able to use, and finally a permit that allows development of light agriculture. Since Pila performed its studies, demands on water resources and arable soils has grown enormously due to high population growth rates. Water scarcity, over-extraction of groundwater, and deteriorating water quality are common occurrences and are increasing over time. And this is not only in Syria, but in Egypt and certainly in Cyprus and many other countries that are in a similar situation. Water shortages in urban areas and limited access to clean drinking water are creating a water crisis. They've already created a water crisis. So, limited arable lands are endangered by intensification of land use and by increasing contamination, degradation, and desertification. An interesting aspect of this is, as I said earlier, not only taking in the technical aspects with the hydrology and geology and geochemistry and so forth, but we're also seeing socioeconomic development of the region. And it's limited by these factors and holds potential for even greater conflicts at the national and international level. I know Cyprus is now having tensions that have arisen over the oil drilling off the coast, but in the future the crisis could easily be related to water. The Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development from Germany and the Arab Center for Studies of Arid Zones and Drylands are also performing work in Syria to address these problems. And the Germans came in after our company was there, and unfortunately there's nobody there at this time working on this problem. It's difficult to estimate the results of management decisions in complex systems characterized by natural parameters such as those affecting Fiji Spring, as well as human factors such as land use and population growth. BMZ and Access are developing decisions, or they did develop a decision support system which involved visualizing and discussing the status quo and possible scenarios with relevant stakeholders. The purpose is to make joint decisions so that accepted water allocations can be established and to reduce conflict between current water users and to lead to more sustainable management of limited water resources for current and future years. So in summary, historically sustainable water resources are a problem which has been dealt with without today's detailed knowledge of hydrogeological systems. And in that instance, history can be used as the basis for ongoing and future studies. Well-planned investigations with quality control protocol and management provide better information upon which to base decisions. New technologies allow more detailed investigations and the acquisition of accurate and verifiable data with which to make projections and model various scenarios. New management systems make it easier for stakeholders to be involved, to minimize conflict, and to collectively arrive at optimal solutions. This process embraces socio-economic development and sustainable water resources for future generations. Speaking of socio-economic development, it's interesting that the International Association of Hydrogeologists, which is one of a contact with IH, was how we got involved in the project in Damascus, Syria. And I'd like to encourage particularly the younger people in the room to become members of professional organizations, whether it's the International Association of Hydrogeologists or other organizations that your professors may very well recommend to you. It's very important as far as networking and the growth of your career, and in the future, if you get into the consulting business or even in the academic field, it can help you advance. So, and speaking of one of the reasons I tied into that is the fact that the IH now has a socio-hydrogeology commission as part of their operation. So, let's see. Another thing that I wanted to go over with you, and which, as I said earlier, we're going to be doing a special issue of the journal Sustainable Water Resources Management, and there'll probably be around 25 plus or minus presentations that are selected for inclusion in that. And Professor Gokchekas and his colleagues or guest editors will be working to decide which presentations to include, and then we'll, Springer requires that articles have at least 2 peer reviewers, and sometimes more depending on the subject. So this process can take a while, and Professor Gokchekas will come up with a deadline for inviting speakers, or inviting authors, and then for them to return their articles, and then for them to be peer reviewed, and then finally to be published. So this will all be set up while we're here, and so if you're interested, please get in touch with with Professor Gokchekis and tell him you're interested in being included. And just one other thing, we've talked about the 3 journals that I'm involved with, but we also do several book series. One is on cave and car systems of the world. Another one is on advances in car science. Another one is professional practice in their sciences. Some professors may have a specific course that they've taught for many years and would like to put that in print. And we also have a book series on pioneers in the earth sciences. Some of your professors may very well qualify for that. So there are many different avenues to get your research published. And I'll be here and be happy to talk with you about exploring those avenues. So thank you very much.